Hey everybody, it's Alicia and welcome to another episode of Tears at the Table. I'm excited because we have a new guest that I've just met for the first time myself named Veronica Thompson. She is a therapist, an LCSW. Side note, I also have my social work degree, so I'm pretty passionate about that. And it is a lot of work to become an LCSW. So she has a lot of experience that has guided her on this journey to be a trauma therapist. She focuses on childhood sexual abuse. She's written a book about it and she has her own incredible testimony. So I want to let her introduce herself a little more. Welcome, Veronica, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Alicia, and thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here. Yeah, so you said a lot about my professional experience. I can just add that I'm a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. I'm a survivor of other types of abuse as well. In clinical work, and you have an LCSW, so you may have heard of the ACE study. This is a study that kind of examines what are the most harmful experiences a child can go through in their development, and those experiences are physical, sexual, and psychological abuse, physical and emotional neglect, divorce, unaddressed mental health issues of a family member, domestic violence, incarceration of a family member, and addiction. And so by the time I got pregnant when I was 16, I was a teen mom. I had experienced all 10 of those. And so I really grew up with a lot of trauma around me and but yet I was a Christian also. And so I just spent a lot of time praying and asking Jesus to help me to understand what was going on and what my role in all of this was. And I felt called to become a therapist and to learn about trauma. And I know that that is where the Holy Spirit guided me because I really felt myself landing in these places that, quote unquote, someone like me was never supposed to be. And so I have all of those experiences and I take those experiences into my work with survivors of all sorts of abuse. And now I'm just trying to open up a conversation with the more broad Christian community, just to talk about what I've learned in my journey, what other people tell me about their journeys, so that we can come together and deal with this together, kind of rather than it just being sort of a clinical issue.
I really appreciate hearing your perspective on that. Something I would add is you've been through all these experiences. How did that affect your relationship with Jesus? How were you able to separate him from all the things that had occurred and that you witnessed in your life?
Yeah. So one of the things that is, I think I learned a little bit later. Earlier in my development, there was a period of time where I was living with my grandparents, and my grandfather was a preacher. My grandmother was very involved with the church. She ran the music program. And so there were Christians everywhere, and there was a lot of prayer and a lot of spoken commitments to Jesus and his mission. And yet I was in a very unsafe environment. The adults knew about it, weren't doing anything. And so I really was struggling, deeply struggling to make sense of all of that. I actually got saved when I was at it. So I was raised in Mississippi and I went to a camp. It was called Camp Garraway. And it was the first time I think I ever was just around a bunch of Christians where I felt safe and I was able to sort of say, okay, I can feel what it's supposed to feel like to feel safe. And I took that experience and then what I learned about Jesus and Christianity from my grandparents. And then I had to move away from my grandparents' home, and I initially lived with my father, and then we moved in with my mother, and then I didn't see them, my other family members, for a really long time. But during that time, there were no Christians around me. I was in a, more like what I would call sort of like a street kid. I was on the streets a lot. There were just lots of traumatic things happening everywhere, and no one was safe. It was just a dangerous environment all the time. And I think the way that I conceptualized this, because I had such a personal relationship with Jesus by that point, I prayed every day. I talked to Jesus. I felt the Holy Spirit. I was praying for deliverance. I didn't know what that was going to look like, but I was confident that it was going to happen. And so I think the way that I think about it is, there's a difference between individual salvation and then believers coming together to create communities. And so I was individually saved. I had a relationship with Jesus. And so as I emerged out of my teenage years with my daughter, my sort of mission was, how do I find other people who are also living in the Spirit, who are also can also see what I think are through the eyes of Jesus, which is, people's despair, people's pain, people's secrets, these things that are being pushed into the darkness, who can also see that and then join me in fighting against these things. And so I just really separated out those things. And I think that was really very helpful for me.
That's a really good way to put it. I'm not going to sidetrack into my own story, but I experienced more of what you said, the individualized salvation, and then trying to find what does it look like to be a body of believers that truly are seeking God's will. And I like that you qualify that and say there can be different environments, and it's important to discern the heart of others, which is really important in your work. I'm sure that you talk about this a lot with kids that you're working with. Now, as you've done this, you shared a little bit about choosing going the clinical route, knowing you were called to do this, but you have moved into a larger sphere now of putting yourself out there, which is a really big deal. And I commend you for that and sharing your story and your heart and honoring your clients in the way that you share their stories and the way you give their perspective. What led to you making that shift?
Hmm. Yeah, so I don't want to go too deeply into sort of the history of psychology. I will just say that psychology, a lot of the clinical work that we do is based on an idea from the early 1900s, which is an idea from Sigmund Freud. And he really believed in individual pathology. And so, even because he'd worked with a lot of survivors of childhood sexual abuse, and his understanding of that was, this looks so prevalent. There's so many people who report this that it can't possibly be true. And so he created this idea that children have sexual fantasies about adults and their parents and so forth. And we know now from research that it is that prevalent, that many children are sexually abused. But I think that one of the things that I really feel called to talk to the Christian community about is to move away from the idea of individual pathology. Because I think what happens so much is that survivors grow up and they recognize something bad happened to me, that harmed me. And then they end up going to therapy. And that healing journey is then just a lot of times just their responsibility. And I think that a lot of Christians that I know and speak to, I was speaking with one woman recently, and she said, I was talking to her about child sexual abuse, and she said, "Oh, that's something that only prayer can address. Like, there's such a big evil that there's just, there's nothing that I can do about that." And I said, "No, no, there are things that we can do about that as a community." And so I think that as a therapist, and that's for adult survivors, oftentimes with children, because I've worked with a lot of children, I worked through the Child Protection Services system. And so I've worked with a lot of parents and communities who the child has been sexually abused. And oftentimes there is a sense of, I'm dropping the child off for therapy, and then they're going to come home and not talk about this anymore because there's really nothing that I can do because it's so damaging. And I want to call the Christian community to reject that. It's not too big for us. We can heal it, we can approach it, and we can push it into the light so that people can begin to heal. And one of the things that we should think about is Sigmund Freud was an atheist. And so if we really are adhering to this idea that pathology is individual and it's the individual's responsibility to heal, that is not a godly idea. God made us to relational. So we heal relationally, and we can heal people in our community by loving them and by walking in painful situations with them and helping them heal and grieving with them. And so that's what I'm sort of calling people to say, it's not too big for us. We can do this. We can have these open conversations, and we can heal this. and we can stop this from happening because it's happening at really alarming rates.
So I appreciate your perspective coming from the social work background. I will say I don't have my full LCSW, and what you just said is part of the reason I was on that track. And what I discovered was you have the two camps. You have the church camp and the psychology camp, and they shouldn't be segregated. They should actually be integrated together. And it is important for people to find healing in a safe environment, which does tend to start one on one with the therapist.
Yeah.
But if that's where we stop, then we haven't completed the job. What
Mhm.
we have to do is say, now you're comfortable with this. I don't know how much you know about what we do here at Tirzah, but that's a huge part of it is saying, and now here's a safe space where you can share your story. You can write an article and use a pen name. And so then you are feeling like I am verbalizing what happened and it's my story to share to the community. And then it's like saying, oh, now you're comfortable there. Would you like to share a video on social media? Would you like to come on the podcast? And it's teaching them to not hide from their story or what happened, but empower them to join in community and be open and honest because healing happens in relationship and those relationships should grow over time.
Yeah, and I will say that I really make an attempt to share my story as much as possible. Usually I'll say I'm a survivor of childhood sexual abuse because I think that that is where the church needs to start.
Yeah.
But in my experience, survivors want to talk about this because
Yeah.
every time I say that, someone says, "Oh, me too. This happened to me." And so I think survivors, when there is a space and someone says, "Hey, it's okay to talk about this," they do and they want to understand it and engage with it. I think that churches need to create more of a space where it feels safer to talk about that.
And kind of shifting gears on that topic of how do you think a church leader could encourage those conversations, especially with young females?
Mhm. Yeah, so I think education and prioritizing the issue. I know that churches have a lot to deal with. They're trying to do a lot of things, but I very strongly feel that this is one of the most important issues that churches have to face. And I have a good friend who is a survivor and an advocate and a mentor in this space, and she wanted to create a women's healing group based on the, I don't know if you've heard of Journey to Heal.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a women's workbook basically to so that you can come together as peers and address what happened and try to get some healing as a community. And she asked the pastor of a very large church, can you make an announcement and just say that we care about this issue and this is available? And he said, no, we have, 30 different groups here, and there's no reason why I would prioritize that over these other. I would have to make an announcement for everything. And when I talked to her, and she just was crying and she was so upset and she just felt so invalidated because she was trying to reach out. And I think that there are a lot of things that churches can do to prevent, address, open up conversations.
Yeah.
But I think it really has to be looked at as something that's happening that's really important, really important. And one of the sort of roots of evil, right? There are a lot of symptoms that happen. There's addiction and homelessness and what we call mental health issues, which is a lot of times just symptoms of what happened to somebody when they were younger. But childhood sexual abuse is one of the main roots of a lot of these things because it happens so much. And so I think prioritizing, understanding the importance, prioritizing that in a church and prioritizing talking about it. And one of the things I will say, because that's an example of a pastor who said, no, I'm not prioritizing. You can put it on the list of groups, but I'm not going to announce it. But a successful example, I was attending a church in Denver, and the pastor just did such a beautiful job of, he had a trauma series. He had his therapist come, they set up lounge, like recliner chairs on the stage, and they talked about what is trauma, how it impacts people, how that was going to be looked at in the church. And then he shared that he was a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. And then he did a series and he said, I'm going to rate the next 8 sermons. Some of them are going to be rated R, some rated PG, some PG-13, and that will tell you who can be in this room while I give that service. And he had one that was rated R, where he really talked about sexual abuse and, the importance of looking at that. And, of course, that was one sermon series that he did among, 30 other ones that year. But he did that, and it was really powerful and really beautiful. And so there are examples of people who are prioritizing this and saying this is important enough for me to talk about and for me to make a series about, because I want to engage in this space of healing.
I really love that. And to add to that, my own positive story, rather than being the topic itself, is just the way pastors can relate to females in the congregation. I went to church on my own and I had some very negative experiences within that. But what
Mhm.
I also had is there's one man who I'm so very close to, who the way he treated me was so different. When I walked in, he prioritized our relationship. It wasn't mine and his wife's, it was mine and his.
Mm.
When there were certain topics that came up, like you said, going along the R rated versus G rated, he'd be like, let's have dinner with my wife, and I'm going to bring her into this conversation, but
Mhm.
I am still going to be present there. And so he prioritized that I was a person worthy of respect, worthy of conversation, worthy of relationship. And I continued to watch the females that came out of his church. I live in a different state, otherwise, I would still be at his church. But
Mhm.
I watched every female that came into his church and out walk away as incredibly strong leaders,
Mhm.
incredibly confident in themselves, and incredibly confident in their relationships with God. And it
Mhm.
truly was the way he chose to relate to the
Mhm.
females in the congregation.
Mhm. That's so important. It really is so important. And I think a lot of churches are run by these ideas that are sort of outdated and they just culture based or tradition based, like women are not allowed to teach when men are in the room. And I have experienced moments where, I mean, I'm a therapist, I'm an educated LCSW, I know a lot about trauma, where, people say you cannot teach or in a room where there are men present. And I think that that idea is really stopping people from engaging in this, because there are way more women who work in social services. There are way more women who are therapists. And so there are a lot of women who have like really in-depth body of knowledge and experience in these issues that are not being welcomed into the conversation.
I agree 100% on that, that there is a time and place where women are the best people to talk about certain things.
Mhm.
And shifting again from church, we know all this happens and we know there's positive experiences, which you should definitely hope to find and seek out. And then
Mhm.
there's the negatives. So I believe part of where we're at now too is teaching women to learn to protect themselves, learn to advocate for themselves within church settings, even. So, what would you say for a woman is she's part of a church community, how she can handle things like sexual abuse?
You mean in terms of her own experience as a survivor?
In her own experience as a survivor, yes.
Yeah, well, I can speak from my experience, like I was sharing with you a moment ago. I am very open at church, especially. I'm open everywhere, but I want to be very open at church because I really want to welcome people into a conversation of healing. So I always share that I'm a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, and I don't expect necessarily everybody to feel comfortable with this topic. And so I know that it can seem, and I've felt this, it can seem sometimes a little bit unfair because I'm the survivor and I had to do the healing, and now I'm the one having to sort of,
Yeah.
push discomfort in the conversations at church. But I try to really remember that that is what I'm called to do. And so if it seems like people are uncomfortable with talking about this or recognizing it as an issue, I just say, okay, you're uncomfortable, but I'm still going to talk about it. I'm still going to be confident in, my own salvation. And I understand that we're not in the kingdom of heaven yet. And I am a follower of Jesus. And so, as part
Mm.
of that role, I have to be willing to say, I'm going to go into an uncomfortable space because I think that the idea that we're supposed to be comfortable all the time and have our best face on all the time and, go to church and pretend that we're all okay and that nothing bad has ever happened to us. I think that that is a very toxic idea and it sort of
Mm.
perpetuates pushing things into the darkness. And so, I really try to step into uncomfortable situations and step into uncomfortable conversations. And then also, if people are really uncomfortable, I try to remember that other people have their own trauma too. And so,
Yes.
oftentimes, when I'm bringing something up, if someone's really uncomfortable with it, that might be an indication that they have some unresolved issues in that area. And so, to be compassionate and to remember that it's a process that happens over time, and that I'm not going to necessarily you know, change the culture of the church overnight. And I think these types of conversations that you and I are having right now really help me and fortify me for that, because I can remember that I'm not alone, that there are other people who are committed to this as well, and that as a community, we're trying to grow the impact and shine the light farther and farther over time.
I love that. That's really great advice. And I struggle with the same thing similarly. I'll be honest and say mine is not childhood sexual abuse, but I've been an advocate for many women. And I grew up in a church that was very cult-like in nature. So even going to church as an adult, it's walking in and saying, you know what, church has not been the safe space for me, and here's why. And you're right, it makes people very uncomfortable when you're open and honest with your testimony. And so it is learning to read the room and come into conversations like we're having and saying, hey, I'm not alone, and wanting to see the church grow. It's not a moment of attacking the church. It's saying, no, I'm committed to the growth together and to continue to challenge. It's like the prophets in the Bible, in all honesty,
Yeah.
being willing to have the hard conversations.
Yeah, and I will say that, if you really think about the impact that you can have on somebody. So I'll give a brief example. I had a client who was she was 8 years old and she was sexually abused by her grandfather, and everybody in her family knew. No one was willing to call CPS or the police and report that because it was an elder in their community, and they tried to separate her away and say, okay, we're not going to allow it anymore, and so we're just going to all move on from this. And the pastor's wife called CPS, called the law, and really it laid a pathway for this accountability and healing of this child. And so if you really just think about the impact that you can have when you say, no, I want to push forward, I
Yeah.
want to shine light, I want to support healing, and I want to follow God's mission, that she had an enormous impact on this child's life. And so, it can be uncomfortable, but sometimes when we do uncomfortable things, it can have really powerful ripple effects.
I love hearing that. And we're running low on time now, and I want to finish off with a question related to young adult women, especially. And
Mhm.
I wanted to ask, what would you say to young women where the topic of sex is difficult because of what they've encountered in their childhood? And when they talk about things like marriage or dating, the thought of sex makes that hard.
Mhm.
What would you say to that girl?
Yeah, so I would say that because child sexual abuse is so prevalent, it can almost make you imagine that almost all the men are perpetrators. Women do sexually abuse, but less than men. But it's actually not true. There are a lot of men who are healthy and can be loving and have the ability for intimate relationships. And abusers tend to abuse serially, meaning once somebody has successfully abused a child, they will continue to abuse. So one abuser typically abuses many, many children. And so it's not that all men out there are harmful abusers. That's not the case. And so what I would encourage someone to do is to find someone who is committed to healing, who can enter that space with her and can have conversations. And then remember that healing comes through love and relationships. And so it's really about engaging in that space, being truthful with your partner, and as you move toward these uncomfortable, intimate moments, that's when you heal. It's actually and that's one of the things with PTSD. One of the things that causes uncomfortable symptoms is avoidance. And so we don't want to avoid. We want to lean into this to these uncomfortable spaces so that the light can shine in there and that God can heal those spaces. And one, Marilyn Vanderkirk, I believe her name is, she was Miss America. She came from a very prominent family and she was a survivor of incest. She talks a lot about her journey of sexual healing with her husband. And she said one of the most powerful moments was, I was uncomfortable and I was scared. And he said, Marilyn, it's okay to have fun. It's okay to enjoy this and be light. And she said she just was able to sort of let a lot of that pain go and to sort of say, like this can actually be a space of fun and excitement too. And so yeah, talk to your partner, engage with your partner, and find somebody who can lean into that space with you because that is where you're going to find healing.
That's amazing advice. I'm not going to add anything to that because that was perfect. And I really appreciate you coming on today and sharing so much wisdom. I feel like we covered a lot more than I had sent you, and it was really good information. So thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed our conversation.